Oklahoma 1974 cold case solved. Arrest shocks community. The room had not changed in years, but time had left its residue on everything. Dust lay in a soft film over the folding chairs, the metal tripod, the boxed camera equipment. Yellowing tape still clung to the concrete floor in faint, broken lines where evidence markers had once stood. The air carried the dry, closed smell of paper and old carpet, like a file left too long in a drawer. When the door opened, the hinges gave a muted complaint, and the past seemed to exhale. Detective Samuel Rourke stepped inside, letting the door settle shut behind him. He did not reach for the light switch immediately. For a moment he stayed in the dimness, listening to the soft tick of the building's pipes and the distant elevator groan. Somewhere 2 floors down, the Oklahoma City field office moved on with routine business. New files, new interviews, new work. Up here, the cold case unit existed in a quieter register, as if the air itself understood that everything on these shelves had already gone wrong once. He took 3 measured steps into the evidence room. On the far wall, a row of metal shelving sagged under the weight of cardboard boxes. Each box carried a black-stamped year: 1971, 1973, 1974. The last one had a small red sticker applied more recently, a quiet mark that meant, "Review requested pending." Rourke's gaze rested there. HOLLOWAY, ELANEM unsolved, 110274. The label was typed in a machine font from another decade. He had seen the name before. Anyone assigned to cold case work in Oklahoma had. It had turned up on training slides, in briefings, in the occasional local article about cases that still haunt. But he had never held the box itself. Now he walked closer, reached out, and placed his hand on the cardboard as if checking for a pulse that would not be there. The surface felt dry and slightly rough under his fingertips. Elaine Maris Holloway, age 24. A nursing student from Bartlesville who had come to Oklahoma City in the early 70s, the first in her family to attempt a professional degree. In the photographs he had seen, she wore her hair pulled back in a loose twist, her expression composed, her posture straight. She had worked evenings at a diner near the hospital, sent money home, and according to neighbors, kept a precise schedule. She had not kept it on the night she died. Back then, the investigation had been handled by men whose names now appeared only in the staff roll of old reports. A patrol officer found Elaine's car pulled off near Lake Overholser, driver's door ajar, purse still on the passenger seat. By the time the call went out and uniforms arrived, the trail had already begun to cool in the autumn air. Interviews followed, statements were taken, canvasses done. And still the file had ended in the same way too many did, with a thin page labeled Case Status Unsolved. Rourke had read that word many times. It always looked clinical in print, but in rooms like this it felt heavier. He pulled the box from the shelf. It gave a small, resistant scrape, then came free. The weight surprised him. Old paper had a way of compacting over time, taking on density. He set it on the central table and opened the lid carefully, as if anything inside might shatter. Inside were the artifacts of another era's investigation. Manila folders, their tabs hand-labeled. Clear evidence bags with paper inserts browned at the edges. A thin stack of black and white photographs held together by a rusting paperclip. A microcassette in a plastic sleeve, the ink on its handwritten label faded but legible. He did not reach for the photographs first. Instead, he stood, hands on the edges of the box, and let himself feel the shape of the moment. A case that had stalled 51 years earlier, gravity attaching to each mistake, each assumption, each small oversight. The box sat like a quiet rebuke. "You waited a long time," he said, voice low, knowing the room would not answer. From the hallway came the faint clack of someone's keyboard, then silence again. The case had never really gone away in Oklahoma. Every few years, a reporter would interview Elaine's surviving relatives, now older, faces lined, eyes tired from waiting. The same questions would rise. Why no answers? Why no resolution? The same responses would be offered. Lack of leads, time passed, witnesses moved away or died. To the public, it sounded like a script. To Rourke, it sounded like a promise that had been made and not kept. He drew the box closer. The first folder he pulled bore the title, Seen Photos, Lake Overholser. He loosened the clip, slid a photograph free, and laid it flat on the table. The image showed a patch of shoreline under a pale November sky, a patrol car in the background, its doors closed, the faint outline of the compact sedan that had belonged to Elaine. In the foreground, an evidence marker bearing the number 3 sunk into the damp ground. The picture was grainy, the details soft, but the silence in it was intact. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Rourke saw not just a printed image, but a frozen decision point. The bright tape and earnest officers of 1974 standing at the edge of something they would leave unsolved. He pictured the young detective he had once been, walking into his own first scene years later, believing that every case could be closed if a person just worked hard enough. Then the vision receded. The evidence room returned. Humming fluorescent light, the faint buzz from the ventilation, the smell of dust and archival cardboard. He reassembled the photographs and slid them back into the folder. There would be time to study them in detail. For now, he needed to accept the basic fact that brought him here. The Holloway case was no longer just a historical entry or training example. It was open again. 2. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. The reopening had not begun with a confession, a tip, or a sudden burst of memory from an old witness. It had started with a routine inventory. 3 weeks earlier, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation had begun digitizing its physical archives, a long-planned effort to scan photographs, transcribe audio, and tag items with metadata for easier search. It was the sort of project that lived at the edge of budgets and patience, only moving forward when grants materialized and someone in administration pressed the issue. This year, someone had pressed. On an overcast Tuesday, a civilian technician named Carla had wheeled a cart of boxes into the imaging lab. Among them was a cardboard carton from 1974 that, according to its faded label, contained property evidence from a series of minor thefts. The tape on it had been replaced at some point. The handwriting on top did not match the older files around it. Carla sliced through the tape with a box cutter, opened the flaps and froze. Inside, on top of a jumble of plastic evidence envelopes, lay a small, flat, white cardboard sleeve, a packet meant for instant photographs. The date on the packet was stamped NOV 1974. A handwritten note below read, Lake Overholser seen. She frowned, checked the box code again, then pulled the packet out and flipped it over. There was no case number on the back, only a scribbled abbreviation and initials. "Hey, Sam," she called across the lab, "this one doesn't match the list." Rourke, who had been reviewing a set of scanned prints from a 1991 case, came over, wiping his palms on his slacks. The packet sat in Carla's gloved hand, small and almost featureless. "I've got this box logged to petty thefts," she said, nodding toward the cart. "But this looks like Seen Photos, Lake Overholser, I think. Wrong box." He took the packet from her carefully. The cardboard felt thin and slightly warped. He did not open it right away. The words Lake Overholser meant one thing in his mind, the Holloway file. "You say this came from a thefts box?" "Yeah, box ID and manifest say stolen property, November 74 East Side. Nothing about a lake." He inspected the box label. The ink had bled slightly over the years, but it was readable. The manifest clip to the side listed watches, wallets, and one revolver. No photographs. "Could be misfiled," he said. "Could be misfiled 20 different ways," Carla replied. "But if it's like Seen Photos from 74, you've only got one major case with that date right." Rourke nodded once. "Holloway." The name hung in the air, familiar yet distant. He carried the packet to a clean work surface and set it down. There was a quiet ceremony to such moments. New items from old cases received a kind of respectful handling. He slid on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, then carefully opened the cardboard sleeve. Inside were 4 instant prints, slightly stuck along their edges. He eased them apart one by one and laid them out in a row under the lamp. The first showed a wide shot of the lakefront, the patrol car visible again, the sedan, the shoreline. The second focused on the sedan alone, angled 3/4, door open, interior dark. The third photograph stopped him. Elaine stood near the waterline in a windbreaker and jeans, her hands in her pockets, her gaze turned slightly away from the camera. The sky above her was pale and flat. The lake surface behind her was calm. To the far right edge of the frame, only partially captured, a second figure appeared. A shoulder, the side of a jaw, the cuff of a pressed shirt. There was no evidence marker in the frame. No officers. The image looked less like documentation and more like something taken in a moment between procedures, when someone had lifted the camera for reasons not recorded. "This can't be a scene photo," Carla said softly, leaning over his shoulder. "She's alive," Rourke finished. It was a simple word, but in the context of a file that began with the date of a person's death, it felt like a new angle. He reached for the fourth photograph. The composition was similar, the same stretch of shoreline, the same woman, but her face turned more toward the camera now. Her expression was neutral, brows slightly drawn, as if someone had asked her a question and she had not yet decided how to answer. The second figure remained half out of frame, closer this time. The edge of a tie was visible, dark against a light shirt. At the bottom margin of the print, handwritten in thin ink, was a note. EMH 1542 prelim. Rourke straightened, feeling the subtle shift in his chest that came when a case offered something new. There had been no mention in the original file of photographs taken before the formal scene documentation. The reports noted the first responding officer, the time the vehicle was found, the call to detectives, but nothing suggested a separate interaction at the water's edge before the body was discovered. Nothing about a person standing with Elaine, face unrecorded, name unstated. "How did these end up in a property box?" Carla asked. "Wrong label, wrong lid, wrong shelf," he said. The answer came out flat, procedural. One mistake repeated enough times. He knew how easily it could happen. A night clerk in 1974, sorting through stacks of evidence at the end of a double shift, slipping a packet into the nearest open carton. A supervisor signing off without checking every line. Years passing, staff changing, records moving from one building to another. "Do you think this is enough to reopen it?" Carla asked. Rourke studied the prints again. A missing piece did not always come with fireworks. Sometimes it arrived as a quiet discrepancy, an image that did not match the written record, a timestamp that did not align, a name that appeared where it should not. "We don't reopen anything," he said. "The facts do, we just listen." But he knew the answer already. A set of previously unknown photographs showing the victim alive at the supposed scene, with an unidentified second figure, taken minutes before the timeline on record. This was not trivia. It was a structural fault in the entire narrative of what they thought had happened. He logged the packet, assigned it a new digital ID, and entered a notation. New photographic evidence discovered during archive digitization project. Possible pre-incident images of victim at scene with unidentified subject. Holloway file recommended for formal review. That afternoon, he carried a summary to his supervisor's office. There was a brief discussion, muted and practical. The word resources was used, also expectations and community interest. In the end, the decision was simple. The Holloway case was moved from the historical ledger to the active review list. An internal notice went out. Case reopened. 3 investigator examines past reports to identify overlooked details. 2 days later, the box sat in an interview room rather than the evidence archive. The room was small, windowless, painted in a neutral color that made no promises. A single camera lens in the corner watched without judgment. The table was metal, the chairs institutional. It was a room built for clarity that sometimes delivered only additional ambiguity. Rourke preferred it to his office. Offices carried distractions: email, ringing phones, colleagues with fresh problems. Here, it was just the file and the quiet. He spread the contents of the Holloway box in a grid on the table. Folders on the left, photographs above, property logs to the right. The new instant print centered like a small, unexpected hinge. The microcassette sat near his notebook. He began with the original incident report. The date at the top, 11/02/1974, dispatched at 1612, Patrol Officer D. Cartwright, reporting Detective L.T. R. Haynes. He read through the narrative, line by line, in the careful, level tone of a person mentally reciting rather than absorbing. Patrol Unit 23 responded to report of abandoned vehicle along Lake Overholser Access Road. Upon arrival, observed 1972 compact sedan, Oklahoma plates, driver's side door open, no occupants in immediate area. The report described the initial search, the call for additional units, the eventual discovery that would change the case category. It recorded distances, weather, light conditions. It made no mention of any interaction with Elaine prior to that. He set the report aside and reached for the supplemental notes from that night. These were less polished, more human, quick lines in ballpoint ink, abbreviations, small corrections. Here, the time of first officer arrival was listed as 16:05, not 16:12. A small discrepancy, but a discrepancy all the same. He circled both times in his notebook. He moved on to witness statements. The diner manager who had seen Elaine leave her shift at 14:30, heading toward the parking lot. A neighbor at her apartment building who heard her door close around 15:00. A group of teenagers who had been near the lake earlier and recalled seeing a small sedan but could not swear it was hers. The language in the statements was ordinary. People remembered coats, car colors, the faint smell of coffee on someone's clothes. They did not remember faces clearly, not at that distance, not after that much time. Rourke wrote a line in his notebook. Timeline, 14:30-16:00, partly unaccounted. He opened another folder, Suspects/Persons of Interest. Inside were brief profiles. A boyfriend whose alibi had checked out, a coworker dismissed after passing a polygraph, a neighbor whose past record had drawn attention but ultimately did not connect. The notes from 1974 carried an undercurrent he recognized from old files, a focus on quick, obvious directions. People close to the victim, people with prior records, people who did not present well in interviews. That era's training had pushed investigators toward certain patterns. Sometimes those patterns served justice. Sometimes they led away from it. He set the suspect folder aside and pulled the property logs closer. The logs listed items collected at the scene: car keys, purse, contents of purse, articles of clothing, soil samples. Each entry bore a tag number. He skimmed until he reached a gap, the place where, if the instant photographs had originally been logged, they should have appeared. There was nothing, no entry for a camera, film, or instant prints. He looked up at the 4 new photographs again. In one, the time was written clearly, 15:42, pre-incident. In the main report, the first call about the abandoned vehicle was logged at 16:12, arrival by 16:25. That left a half-hour window between the moment the photograph showed Elaine alive at the water's edge and the moment she became a name in a file. The original investigators had not accounted for that half hour in any structured way. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the worn plastic press against his shoulder blades, and closed his eyes briefly. There was a temptation in cold casework to assume that earlier detectives had simply missed what now seemed obvious. Rourke had learned to resist that. People worked within their training, their tools, their time pressures. They made choices they believed were reasonable. But the facts remained, and those facts did not change to protect anyone's reputation. He opened his eyes and picked up a different document, a memo from 1975, summarizing why the case was being shifted to inactive status. It cited lack of actionable leads, no new information, and declining probability of fruitful inquiry. The language was clinical, like a diagnosis. Underneath, in a handwritten note that had not been part of the formal text, someone had added, "We did what we could." Rourke tapped his pen against the margin. He returned to the photographs, this time laying them in chronological sequence. Wide scene, car alone. Elaine near the water with partial figure. Elaine closer to camera, note and time at the bottom. Then the standard scene photos from later, with evidence markers and uniformed personnel. He studied the partial figure at the frame's edge. The person wore a light shirt, dark tie, and a structured jacket, not a uniform, not casual. The jawline suggested an adult male, but the image was too soft for certainty. He jotted, unidentified male, professional dress, possibly investigator, possibly associate. If the figure had been an officer, someone would have noted an interaction. There would have been an entry in a log, a reference to initial contact. Instead, the records jumped directly from discovery of the vehicle to the search and subsequent classification of the scene. He reached for the microcassette. The label read, HAINES Field Notes, 110274. He slid it into a small digital converter the lab used for old recordings and watched the numbers on the device light up. After a moment, the room filled with a thin, slightly distorted voice. Arrived at location approximately 1625. A man's tone, formal but not fully measured, suggesting he had been speaking these notes after a long day. Weather overcast, ground firm, visibility adequate. The recording continued with standard observations. Vehicle make and model, position relative to the road. No fresh tire tracks beyond those recorded. It matched the written report almost word for word. Rourke listened through once, then rewound and listened again, this time focusing on breaths, pauses, any offhand comment that might have slipped in. At the 6-minute mark, there was a slight rustle of paper, then a pause longer than the others. Unsure, Haynes's voice said, quieter now, almost as if he had turned away from the recorder. Could be nothing. We'll leave out for now until confirmed. Then a click and the recording ended. Rourke sat very still. He replayed the last 20 seconds several times. The words were plain, but they did not correspond to any part of the written record. There was no memo, no addendum, no supplement where Haynes had later confirmed or addressed whatever he had been unsure about. He wrote the line verbatim into his notebook, underlined it twice. Could be nothing. We'll leave out for now until confirmed. Leave out what? He looked again at the new photographs, at the unidentified figure standing almost inside the frame, almost acknowledged. Slowly, methodically, he began a new timeline on a blank page. Left column, times. Middle column, events as recorded. Right column, discrepancies, questions, omissions. 1542, new photograph. Elaine at lake with unknown male, not an original report. 1605/1612, conflicting dispatch arrival times. 1625, recorded arrival of Detective Haynes at scene. Post-scene, Haynes records audio notes, references something left out, pending confirmation. He drew a thin line from the 1542 entry to the handwritten note on the photograph, another from the 1625 entry to the microcassette quotation. The lines did not answer anything yet. They simply indicated where the silence in the record might not be empty at all, but filled with something someone had chosen not to put on paper. He capped his pen, set it down, and let the room settle again. Outside, somewhere in the building, a phone rang, then stopped. The ventilation hummed. The camera in the corner watched without comment. Inside the interview room, surrounded by old paper and new questions, Detective Samuel Rourke understood two things clearly. First, the Holloway case had not lacked information. It had lacked structure. Second, somewhere in the layers of omission and habit, a small, devastating fact waited, something that had been visible in 1974, but not recognized for what it meant. He turned back to the file, ready to keep looking. The following week, the Holloway case file expanded like a quiet storm. New angles appeared not through breakthroughs, but through methodical rechecks, the kind of work that required patience more than inspiration. Detective Rourke spent hours reconstructing a network of individuals whose names had once lived at the margins of the original reports. Some were mentioned only in passing. Others had been dismissed early for reasons that seemed, 50 years later, too neat. He began with the partial figure in the rediscovered photographs. The image quality offered nothing definitive, only a hint of stature, a pressed shirt, the edge of a jacket. But that minimal profile aligned with a small subset of people who had been near Lake Overholser that afternoon. Rourke created a list of those who could fit: early responders, plainclothes personnel, nearby employees, individuals known to Elaine, and one or two who appeared in older interviews but had been set aside without explanation. He started at the top. Lieutenant Robert Haynes, lead investigator in 1974, the thin-voiced man whose microcassette mentioned something he intended to leave out for now. The image in the instant print did not contradict him completely. Haynes had the build, the posture, but the jacket in the photo appeared newer, more fitted. The timeline also showed a difference. Haynes was recorded as arriving at 1625, while the photograph time-stamped 1542 showed someone already present with Elaine. Still, Rourke made a note, not because he suspected misconduct, but because cold cases demanded neutrality. Even established timelines were not granted immunity. Officer Dennis Cartwright, first responder. He had been a young patrol officer at the time, still in training rotation. His uniform would have been identifiable in the photograph. The figure in the frame wore no badge or visible gear. Cartwright's statements from the period were consistent. His records showed years of steady work, commendations, no disciplinary flags. In an interview conducted decades later for training materials, he had expressed regret about the case but nothing more. Rourke moved him to unlikely, but not off the list. Dr. Warren Grable, local physician, noted in a 1974 witness summary. He had been walking along the lakeshore for exercise the afternoon of the incident. He had told officers he saw no one except a young couple sitting on the grass several yards away. That line in his statement had always seemed incidental. The 1974 investigators assumed he referred to unrelated park visitors. Now, with the new photographs, the word couple acquired weight. Rourke retrieved Dr. Grable's file. At the time, he was in his mid-30s, practiced internal medicine, and had no record that drew investigative scrutiny. He had since passed away, making direct interviews impossible. But his estate records, archived with the county, revealed something small. He had kept a personal notebook of his daily walks, mostly notes on weather and mileage. In the November 2 entry, one line stood alone: "Saw someone I recognized." No name, no detail, only